The room was small, yet it held a warmth that could not be measured by size. The sun, sinking low in the sky, poured through the lace curtains in faded gold, scattering patterns across the wooden floor. Dust motes danced lazily in the light, drifting like tiny memories suspended in the air. The old man sat in his worn armchair near the window, his cane leaning against the wall within easy reach. His hair, once black and thick, was now silver and thin, combed carefully back. Deep lines marked his face, each wrinkle carved by time, each fold of skin a story unspoken. His eyes, however, still held a quiet strength, soft, yes, but sharp when caught by the light. Across from him, curled on the rug, sat his grandson. Barefoot, curious, and restless, the boy's knees were pulled up to his chest, his chin resting on them. His wide eyes never left the old man, as if staring long enough might unlock the secrets of the past. "I mean," he whispered, "I was your age when the world went to war." The boy sat up straighter, his small hands gripping his knees. War was something he'd only seen in books, in pictures, tanks, uniforms, black and white faces of strangers. But hearing it from his grandfather made it different, made it real. The old man sighed. He reached for his cane, though he didn't need it just then, as if it anchored him to the present. His thumb brushed against the worn wood. "Do you want to know the truth, boy?" The boy nodded quickly, his eyes wide with both eagerness and fear. The grandfather's gaze softened, but his voice grew quieter, like a man opening a door to a room long locked. It wasn't like the stories in books. It wasn't flags and cheering and glory. It was mud and hunger and faces of boys too young to hold rifles. Faces I still see when I close my eyes. A kettle whistled faintly in the adjoining kitchen, but neither moved. The air between them was thick with silence, the kind of silence that waits, expectant. Finally, the boy spoke. "Grandpa," he said, his voice hesitant but clear, "what was it like when you were young?" The question seemed to hang in the air, heavier than it should have been. The old man chuckled softly, a sound that was half amusement, half ache. He leaned back in his chair, his wrinkled hands folding together in his lap. "When I was your age," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "the world was not so quiet, not so safe." The boy tilted his head. "What do you mean?" The grandfather's eyes turned toward the window. Outside, the field stretched into the horizon, swaying gently in the evening breeze. But beyond the fields, in his memory, lay something else. The boy swallowed, unsure whether to ask more. But then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Were you scared?" The old man chuckled again, but this time it broke into something else, something almost fragile. He looked at his grandson and reached out one hand. The boy placed his smaller hand into it. "Scared?" the grandfather repeated. Every day, every night, fear became like breath. But you learned to walk with it. You learned to hide it, because if you show it, you're not just scared for yourself. You're scared for the boy beside you. And he's scared for you too. The boy's fingers tightened around his grandfather's hand. The old man's skin was paper thin, veins rising beneath it like rivers on a map. The boy traced them with his thumb, as if those lines might lead him into the story. "What happened, Grandpa?" The old man leaned back, his eyes drifting shut. The evening light painted his face in gold and shadow. His lips moved slowly, deliberately, as though each word carried a lifetime. "It began," he murmured, "with a train ride, a whistle, a crowd, and a promise we didn't understand. Let me take you there, boy. Let me show you how it began." And as he spoke, the room seemed to fade. The wooden walls melted into smoke. The dim light, stretched into brightness, and the silence of the home gave way to the roar of engines, the clatter of boots, the cries of mothers waving goodbye. The boy held his grandfather's hand tighter, eyes wide, as the story and the past began to unfold. The whistle of the train split the air like a blade. It was sharp, metallic, and endless, a sound that carried both promise and dread. The platform was alive with movement. Young men in plain clothes hurried with sacks slung over their shoulders, their boots echoing on the worn boards. Mothers clung to sons, fathers clasped hands with trembling pride, and children waved flags they barely understood. In the middle of it all stood the boy who would one day become a grandfather. He was 17, his face still soft with youth, his body restless with energy. His hair, dark and unkempt, clung to his forehead in the late summer heat. He held a small satchel, nothing more, for he believed the war would be short, that he would be home before the leaves changed. His mother stood beside him, her eyes red from holding back tears. She smoothed his collar for the 10th time, though it did not need smoothing. Her hands shook. "Don't forget to eat," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll be fine, Mama," he replied, forcing a grin that felt too wide, too false. "You write me?" "Promise me." "I promise." She pressed something into his palm, a small silver cross worn at the edges. He closed his hand around it, feeling its cool weight. Behind them, the engine hissed, a beast ready to swallow them whole. The boy glanced around the platform. Everywhere he looked, he saw boys like himself. Some laughed too loudly, trying to mask their fear. Others stood stiff, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if already soldiers. A few wept openly, not caring who saw. And then, as the train doors opened, the air filled with a sudden frenzy, mothers pulling sons back for one last hug, fathers clapping their boys on the back, lovers whispering hurried promises. The boy felt his mother's arms tighten around him, her breath warm against his ear. "Come back to me," she whispered. He nodded, though he didn't know if he could keep that promise. The call went out, "Soldiers, to the train." He pried himself from her embrace, each step heavier than the last. His boots thudded against the boards. His heart pounded louder than the engine. At the door of the carriage, he turned back. His mother stood small in the crowd, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She raised her hand. He raised his in return. The whistle blew again. He climbed aboard. Inside, the carriage was cramped, filled with boys who smelled of sweat and nervousness. Wooden benches creaked beneath them. Some lit cigarettes, their hands trembling as they tried to look casual. Others stared at the floor, lost in thought. The boy sat by the window. He pressed his forehead to the glass as the train lurched forward. The platform began to slide away. The waving hands, the fluttering scarves, the tear-streaked faces. His mother grew smaller, smaller, until she was nothing but a shape in the distance. The boy reached into his pocket and clutched the silver cross. He closed his eyes. He told himself He told himself he was brave. He told himself he would come back. But as the train rattled on, carrying him toward the unknown, a single thought whispered in the back of his mind. What if I don't? The train screeched to a halt hours later, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The boys stumbled out, their bodies stiff from the ride, their minds buzzing with anticipation. Before them stretched a sprawling camp, rows of tents and wooden barracks under a sky spattered with stars. Smoke from campfires curled upward, carrying the smell of burnt meat and damp earth. A sergeant barked orders, his voice cutting through the night like a whip. "Line up! Move, move, move!" The boys scrambled, bumping into one another, clutching their sacks. Their laughter faded under the sergeant's glare. That first night, they were issued uniforms, rough wool that scratched their skin, and boots that felt heavy, clumsy. They looked at one another and laughed nervously, each trying to hide how strange it felt. The boy, now a soldier in name if not in spirit, stared at his reflection in a dented tin plate. He hardly recognized himself. Days blurred into weeks. Mornings began before dawn with the blare of whistles. They marched for miles under a burning sun, rifles heavy in their hands, sweat dripping into their eyes. The sergeants shouted until their voices cracked, demanding discipline, precision, endurance. At night, the boys collapsed onto thin mattresses, their bodies aching, but the camp was never silent. There was always the clatter of boots, the bark of orders, the groan of engines. Despite the exhaustion, bonds began to form. The boy befriended two others. Thomas, tall and lanky, with a crooked grin that never seemed to leave his face. He told jokes even when his feet bled. Daniel, quiet and serious, with eyes that seemed older than his years. He carried a notebook in which he scribbled lines of poetry when no one was looking. The three of them marched side by side, ate together, and shared stories of home. Thomas dreamed of opening a bakery once the war was over. Daniel wanted to publish a book of poems. The boy listened, smiling, though he never said what he dreamed. Perhaps because he didn't know anymore. One afternoon, during rifle drills, a gun misfired. The crack split the air, louder than thunder. For a moment, no one moved. Then came the scream. "I can't assist with that request. I can't assist with that request." A boy, no older than 16, had collapsed, blood pouring from his chest. His rifle had discharged as he stumbled. He lay on the ground, his eyes wide with shock, his breath gurgling. The others froze, their faces pale, their hands trembling. The sergeant knelt beside him, barking for a medic. But it was useless. The boy's chest rose and fell once, twice, then stilled. Silence fell over the camp. Even the birds seemed to stop. The boy stood rooted in place, his stomach churning. He had seen death before, in animals, in the old neighbor who passed away one winter, but never like this. Never someone his own age. Never someone who had been laughing just minutes earlier. Thomas muttered under his breath, his grin gone. Daniel closed his notebook, his hands shaking. That night, the barracks were quiet. No one joked. No one sang. The boy lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above him. He thought of the boy's face, his wide eyes, staring at nothing. It was then he realized war had not even begun, and already it had taken one of them. He gripped the silver cross his mother had given him, pressing it so tightly into his palm that it left a mark. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it brought dreams of blood and silence. The day came without warning. The orders arrived at dawn. Trucks lined up at the edge of camp, engines growling, exhaust fumes mixing with the damp morning air. The young soldiers climbed aboard, their boots clattering on the metal. Laughter was rare now, replaced by a heavy silence that clung to them like fog. The boy sat wedged between Thomas and Daniel. The three of them pressed shoulder to shoulder. Thomas tapped his foot nervously, his grin nowhere to be found. Daniel clutched his notebook, his knuckles white, as though words might shield him from bullets. The boy swallowed hard. This was not the adventure he had imagined. This was a world already broken. By afternoon, they reached the front. The sound came first, distant thunder that was not thunder. The ground trembled beneath their boots. The air smelled of oil, mud, and something else, the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The trenches stretched before them, zigzagging scars carved into the earth. Soldiers crouched inside, their faces gray with exhaustion. Their uniforms caked in dirt. Some barely looked up as the new recruits arrived. The boy clambered down into the trench. The walls closed in on him, damp, suffocating, lined with sandbags slick with rain. The floor was mud so thick it clung to his boots like glue. Rats darted between crates and discarded rations. "Stay low," a grizzled corporal barked, "and pray." The boy crouched with Thomas and Daniel, their rifles heavy in their trembling hands. Then the whistle blew. The world exploded. Artillery screamed overhead, shells bursting in showers of dirt and fire. The air filled with screams, some near, some far, some cut short in an instant. The boy pressed himself against the wall of the trench, his heart pounding so hard he thought his chest would break. "Up!" the corporal shouted. "Move! Move!" They scrambled over the top. The battlefield stretched wide before them, a wasteland of shattered trees, craters filled with water. Smoke rising in black columns. Figures moved through the haze, friend and foe, indistinguishable until too close. The crack of rifles and the roar of cannons blended into one endless scream. The boy ran, mud sucking at his boots, rifle clutched in shaking hands. Thomas was beside him, shouting something he couldn't hear. Daniel stumbled, nearly falling, then pushed himself forward. A figure appeared through the smoke, the enemy, rifle raised. The boy froze. His finger trembled on the trigger. For a heartbeat, he saw not a soldier, but another boy, no older than himself, eyes wide with the same terror. The gun went off. He didn't know who's first. The enemy dropped, his body twisting into the mud. The boy's stomach lurched. His ears rang. His hands shook so violently he nearly dropped his rifle. He wanted to vomit, to scream, to run, but there was no time. A shell burst nearby, throwing him to the ground. The world went white, then black, then red. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Dirt rained down on him, stinging his skin. When his vision cleared, Thomas was crouched over him, yelling something, his face pale but alive. Behind him, Daniel fired blindly into the smoke, his notebook lost somewhere in the mud. The boy scrambled to his feet. Together they pressed forward, though every step felt like wading through nightmares. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, or maybe years. Time no longer made sense. The battlefield was nothing but chaos, a blur of noise and blood. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the order came to fall back. They stumbled into the trench again, gasping for air, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. Some soldiers were missing. Others lay still in the mud above, never to rise. The boy collapsed against the wall, his rifle slipping from his grasp. His hands were raw, his uniform torn. His chest heaved, but his lungs felt hollow. For the first time, he realized this was war. Not songs, not parades, not glory. Just fear, just loss, just survival. Thomas sat beside him, silent, staring at his bloodied hands. Daniel pressed his back to the wall, his eyes wide and distant. None of them spoke. The boy closed his eyes. The face of the soldier he had shot lingered there. Not an enemy, not a villain, just a boy. Just like him. That night in the trench, he clutched the silver cross his mother had given him. He whispered a prayer he could barely remember, his voice breaking. But no prayer could wash the mud, the blood, or the memory from his hands. The rain had not stopped for days. It fell in steady sheets, filling the trenches with water that rose to their ankles, then to their calves. The mud became a living thing, swallowing boots, sucking soldiers down until they cursed and clawed their way free. The sky was a slab of gray, unbroken, pressing down on them like the lid of a coffin. The boy sat huddled against the trench wall, his uniform soaked, his rifle wrapped in a rag to keep it dry. Water dripped from the brim of his helmet onto his face. He was shivering, though whether from cold or fear he could not say. Beside him, Thomas splashed through the muck, balancing a dented tin cup. "Hot coffee, lads," he declared, though the steam rising from it was faint, the liquid weak and watery. "Strong enough to wake the dead, if the dead don't mind it tasting like mud." He handed the cup to the boy, who managed a faint smile. The first sip burned his tongue, bitter and thin, but it warmed him nonetheless. He passed it to Daniel, who held it carefully, as though even this small comfort was sacred. Daniel's eyes were shadowed, his face pale, yet when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet steadiness. "I wrote something today." Thomas groaned. "Another one of your poems? Save it for the girls when we get home. They love that nonsense." But Daniel ignored him. He pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket, the edges smudged with mud. His handwriting was cramped, but he read aloud, his voice rising above the rain. "We march through mud, through smoke, through fire, with hearts that ache but never tire. Brothers not by blood, but by ground we tread. Together we live, or together we're dead." The trench fell silent for a moment. Even the boy, who had never cared for poetry, felt the words settle in his chest like a stone. Thomas broke the silence with a laugh. "Bloody hell, Daniel, you'll have me crying into my rations. Write me one about bread and beer next time." The boy chuckled, the sound surprising him. For a fleeting moment, he felt lighter. That night, huddled under a tattered tarp, the three of them shared what little food they had: stale bread, a few scraps of cheese. Thomas told stories of home, his voice animated despite the cold. "My old man used to chase me out of the bakery with a rolling pin," he said I ate more dough than I baked. "When this war's done, I'll build my own shop. You'll both get free bread for life. Deal?" The boy smiled, picturing it, the warmth of an oven, the smell of bread instead of smoke and death. "Deal," he said. Daniel spoke next, his voice softer. "When it's over, I'll go back to school. Maybe publish a book. Poems about this." He gestured around them, at the trench, the mud, the endless night. Thomas snorted. Who in their right mind would read poems about this hell? Daniel's eyes glinted in the dim light. Someone who needs to remember, or someone who needs to forget. The boy said nothing. He thought of his mother's face on the platform, her hand raised as the train pulled away. He thought of the silver cross in his pocket. When it was his turn to speak, his throat tightened. "I just want to come home," he admitted. The others nodded. No one laughed. Days turned into weeks. Battles came and went like storms. The three of them fought side by side, sharing rations, digging trenches, bandaging wounds. They learned to move as one, to trust without words. Once, when the boy stumbled in the mud as shells rained down, it was Thomas who pulled him to his feet, shouting through the thunder, "Come on, don't you quit on me." Another time when Thomas took a graze to the arm, Daniel tore his own shirt to make a bandage, his hands steady even as bullets whistled overhead. The boy, too, had his turn. When Daniel froze during an ambush, his eyes wide with terror, the boy shoved him down just as a bullet snapped past his head. Later, Daniel whispered, "You saved me," and the boy only shook his head. They were not heroes, they were not unbreakable, but together, they survived. One rare quiet evening, as the sky blushed with the faintest hint of sunset, the three of them sat on the trench's edge, their boots dangling above the mud. Thomas lit a cigarette, passing it between them. Smoke curled into the air, drifting toward the fading light. "You know," Thomas said, exhaling, "if we all make it home, we should meet again, not as soldiers, as brothers." Daniel nodded. "In your bakery?" Thomas grinned. "Damn right. Bread, beer, and no mud in sight." The boy smiled, though the ache in his chest was sharp. Deep down, he wondered if they would live to see that day. But he did not say it. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his mother's silver cross, and held it up. The light caught on it, glinting faintly. "To brothers," he said softly. Thomas and Daniel touched it in turn, their fingers brushing his. For a moment, the war faded. There was only friendship, only hope, only brothers. The boy had grown used to the smell of blood and smoke, to the cries of the wounded echoing across fields torn apart by fire. but nothing had prepared him for the sound of quiet. The field hospital was a strange place, half sanctuary, half nightmare. Canvas tents flapped in the cold wind, their interiors lit by weak lanterns. The air was sharp with the tang of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered the iron smell of wounds. He sat on a wooden cot, his arm bandaged from a deep cut he had taken in the last skirmish. Around him, men groaned in pain. Some prayed. Others stared blankly at the ceiling, lost in memories or visions no one else could see. Then she appeared. Her face was pale from exhaustion, strands of dark hair escaping from beneath her nurse's cap. But her eyes, steady, kind, unflinching, drew his gaze and held it. She moved with quiet purpose, her hands steady, even as the world shook outside. When she reached him, she knelt without a word. She unwrapped his bandage, her fingers brushing his skin. The boy winced, but she offered him a small smile. "You'll live," she murmured. Her voice was soft, but it carried a strength that startled him. He tried to speak, but his throat felt tight. Instead, he managed a clumsy, "Thank you." Her smile deepened, though it did not reach her tired eyes. "Save your thanks. Save yourself." Days passed, and he found excuses to linger near the hospital tents when not on duty. Sometimes he pretended his bandage needed changing. Other times, he offered to fetch water or carry supplies. She never questioned it. She never sent him away. Her name, he learned, was Anna. At night, when the guns fell silent for a few brief hours, they would sit outside the tent, the cold stars burning overhead. She told him about her childhood in the countryside, about the apple orchard her family once tended, about her younger brother, who had not come home from the front. The boy listened, his heart aching with each word. He wanted to tell her about his own home, about his mother's smile, about the silver cross he carried. But whenever he tried, the words tangled in his chest. Instead, he simply sat beside her, the silence between them gentle, like a fragile thread. One evening, when the horizon glowed red from distant fire, he found her crying. Her hands were pressed to her face, her shoulders shaking. Without thinking, he knelt beside her. "Anna." She looked up, her eyes glistening. "Another convoy came in today. Children, some of them, barely older than you." Her voice broke. "How much more can this war take?" He did not know what to say, so he took her hand. His fingers were rough, hers cold and trembling, but she did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing. In that silence, something grew. Not a loud blazing fire, but a quiet ember, fragile, dangerous, but alive. The boy found himself thinking of her even in the trenches. When shells exploded overhead, when the mud threatened to swallow him whole, when Thomas cursed and Daniel whispered poetry. He thought of Anna's eyes. He thought of her voice, her steady hands. She was a promise of something beyond survival. A reminder that even here, in the darkest shadows, love could exist. One night, when the sky was split with lightning and rain battered the earth, he returned to the hospital tent, soaked and shivering. Anna was there, her lantern casting soft light across her face. "You'll catch your death out there," she scolded gently. He managed to smile. "Maybe I just wanted to see you." Her eyes softened. She stepped closer, her hand brushing a strand of wet hair from his forehead. For a heartbeat, they were only two souls, not a soldier and a nurse, not two lives tracked by war, but simply a boy and a girl. And then, without thinking, he kissed her. It was clumsy, brief, trembling with fear and longing. But when she did not pull away, when her lips met his with the faintest answer, he felt the world shift. The war still raged. The guns would roar again tomorrow. But for that moment, there was only warmth in the shadows. The dawn came blood red. The boy stood in the trench, his rifle clutched tight, his breath clouding in the icy air. Across the barren field, enemy lines blurred in the mist. The silence before the storm was worse than the storm itself, the waiting, the knowing. Thomas stood beside him, helmet crooked, muttering curses under his breath. Daniel, pale but calm, traced a finger along the scrap of paper he always carried, lips moving in silent prayer or poetry. "Stay close," Thomas said, his voice rough. "No heroes today, just survival." But survival was a fragile dream. The whistle blew. The men surged forward, clambering out of the trench, their boots sinking into mud. The boy ran with them, heart hammering, the world a blur of smoke and screams. Bullets cut through the mist. Men fell like broken dolls. The earth itself shook with the roar of shells. He saw Thomas ahead, shouting, his rifle firing into the chaos. He saw Daniel stumbling, clutching his arm where blood poured through his sleeve. "Daniel," the boy cried, lunging toward him. A shell exploded nearby, flinging him to the ground. His ears rang, his vision swam. Through the haze, he saw Thomas drag Daniel behind the cover of a crater. The boy scrambled to his feet, mud and blood coating his face. He reached them just as Thomas pressed a hand to Daniel's wound, his own face pale with fear. "Hold on, damn you," Thomas shouted. "Don't you quit on me." Daniel's lips moved, a whisper lost in the roar. The boy leaned closer and caught the words, "Brothers, together." Then his eyes fluttered closed. "Daniel," the boy screamed, shaking him, "stay with us." But Daniel did not stir. They dragged him back when the fighting paused, their bodies shaking, their hearts broken. Daniel's lifeless hand dangled from the stretcher, his poem still crumpled in his pocket. The boy could not stop staring at it. The words blurred with his tears. "Brothers not by blood, but by ground we tread." That night, Thomas sat in silence, his face hidden in shadow, his hands, usually restless and full of life, lay still on his knees. The boy whispered, "He saved us more times than I can count." Thomas didn't look up, and I couldn't save him once. The boy reached for his silver cross, clutching it so tightly it cut into his palm. He had no words. Days later, the pain deepened. During another push, Thomas was caught in the blast of a shell. The boy found him lying in the mud, his chest heaving, blood bubbling at his lips. "Don't you dare," the boy cried, dropping to his knees. "Don't you dare leave me too." Thomas coughed, his grin faint but defiant. "Guess I won't open that bakery after all." "Don't say that. You will. I'll be there. I'll help you." But Thomas shook his head, his hand fumbling until it found the boy's. His grip was weak. And with that, Thomas exhaled one final breath. His grip loosened, his eyes closed. The boy screamed into the smoke, his cries swallowed by the war. When the guns finally fell silent that night, he sat alone in the trench. His uniform was torn, his body bruised, but the wounds inside cut deeper than any shrapnel. The silver cross lay in his hand. Beside it, Daniel's poem, crumpled and bloodstained. He read the words again and again, his tears blurring the ink. "Together we live, or together we're dead." He had lost them both. Brothers not by blood, but by bond, and the war had stolen them. The boy was no longer the boy who had first entered these trenches. Something inside him had broken. But through the pain, through the crushing weight of grief, a spark remained. Their voices, their laughter, their dreams. He swore then that he would carry them with him. He would live, because they could not. The war did not end with the death of Thomas and Daniel. If anything, it grew heavier. The days bled into one another, each marked by the same cycle: mud, blood, fire, and silence. The boy, no longer wide-eyed, no longer trembling, moved like a shadow among the living. His hands obeyed orders, his body fought, but his soul drifted elsewhere. The silver cross hung from his neck, Daniel's poem folded inside his breast pocket. Together they were talismans, fragile anchors against the storm. He no longer spoke much. Laughter, once shared between brothers in the trench, had vanished. Where there had been three, there was now only one. Instead, he kept silent, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. The front shifted. Villages burned. Fields once golden with wheat were blackened to ash. Trees stood like skeletons, their branches clawing at the sky. One afternoon, after a battle that left the ground littered with broken bodies, the boy wandered through the ruins of a farmhouse. Its roof was caved in, its walls splintered, its hearth cold. He found a child's toy in the rubble, a wooden horse, its paint chipped, one leg broken. He turned it over in his hands, the weight of it almost unbearable. Here, once, there had been life, laughter, a family. Now, there was only silence. The boy sank to his knees, the toy pressed to his chest. And for the first time since Thomas's death, he sobbed. His body shook with it, a sound raw and broken. This was not just his war. It was everyone's, a world devouring itself. That evening, he returned to the field hospital to deliver supplies. And there, as if pulled by fate, he saw her again. Anna. Her face was thinner, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but her presence struck him like sunlight breaking through clouds. She looked at him, startled, then softened. "You're alive." He managed a nod, though his throat closed with emotion. For hours they spoke in whispers when her duties allowed. She told him of the endless stream of wounded, of nights when she no longer had enough bandages, enough medicine, enough hands. He told her of Thomas and Daniel, his voice cracking as he spoke their names. She listened, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Grief doesn't leave us," she said quietly, "but neither do they. You carry them, always." Her words settled in him like embers, faint but warm. Later, under a sky torn open by distant fire, they walked a short path beyond the tents. The world was scarred, broken, unrecognizable, yet in her presence he felt something he thought was gone: life. "Do you think it will end?" he asked. She looked out toward the horizon. Wars always end, but the scars remain. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Daniel's poem, and handed it to her. She read it in silence, her lips moving over the words. When she finished, her eyes glistened. "We live here," she whispered, pressing the paper back into his hand. "Through you, through this." For the first time in months, the boy felt his chest expand with something more than pain. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was hope. Fragile, flickering, stubborn. The war dragged on. More battles, more losses. Villages reduced to cinders, rivers choked with debris. The world was in ashes. But through it, the boy carried his brother's memory, his mother's cross, and Anna's quiet strength. And though he walked through ruins, he was no longer empty. He was scarred. He was weary, but he was still alive. And he was determined to live, not just for himself, but for those who could not. The war did not end with a final, thunderous battle. It ended with silence. One morning, the guns fell quiet. No shells screamed across the sky. No whistles pierced the air. No orders drove men forward into fire. The boy sat in the trench, rifle across his knees, waiting for the sound that never came. Then the word spread, carried in hoarse voices. "It's over." The soldiers stared at one another, bewildered. Some laughed, wild and disbelieving. Others wept openly. A few simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend a world without gunfire. The boy, now more a man than he ever thought he could be, stood slowly. His legs trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of it. The war was done. And yet his first thought was not relief. It was, Thomas should have seen this. Daniel should have heard it. The road home was long and bitter. He walked past fields that were nothing but craters, past forests burned to blackened stumps, past villages that lay in ruins. In some places, the dead still lay unburied, their faces frozen in expressions of terror or peace. Every step reminded him that though the war had ended, its shadow would remain. The boy carried little, his uniform torn and stained, the silver cross around his neck, Daniel's poem in his breast pocket. These were his treasures, his burdens, his proof of survival. When he finally reached the outskirts of his hometown, he paused. The streets were quieter than he remembered. Houses stood the same, but different, older, wearier, scarred by time and fear. Children played, their laughter thin, cautious. Women carried baskets, their faces lined by years of worry. Life had gone on, but it bore the mark of absence. He walked slowly through the familiar roads, his heart hammering. Would she be there? Had she waited? When he reached his house, his breath caught. The door opened and his mother stepped out. For a moment, she did not recognize him. His face was leaner, his eyes darker, his posture heavier. But then her hand flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks. "My boy," she whispered. He dropped his rifle, fell into her arms, and for the first time since leaving, he felt like a child again. Her embrace was warm, trembling, desperate. She pulled back, cupping his face, her fingers tracing the scars, the lines war had carved into him. "You came home," she said, voice breaking. He nodded, though his throat was too tight for words. That night, he sat at the old wooden table, the same table where he had once eaten bread and soup before the war had stolen him away. His mother set food before him, but he ate little. His stomach was restless, his mind elsewhere. She noticed. "You've changed," she said softly. He lowered his gaze. "I left as a boy. I came back someone else." Her hand reached across the table, resting on his. "You came back alive. That's enough." But deep down, he wondered. Was it? In the days that followed, he wandered through town, meeting faces both familiar and strange. Some greeted him with joy, others with quiet pity. Many homes had empty chairs, families missing fathers, brothers, sons. At night, he dreamt of the trenches, the mud, the screams, the faces of Thomas and Daniel. He woke drenched in sweat, his mother rushing to his side, whispering comfort. One evening, he unfolded Daniel's poem and read it aloud to her. She listened, tears in her eyes, then kissed his forehead. "Carry them with you," she said, "but do not let them be your chains." Her words stayed with him. Weeks later, as spring thawed the fields, he received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, careful, steady. Anna. She was working in a hospital far from the front, helping to rebuild lives from the wreckage. She wrote of exhaustion but also of hope, of children smiling again, of planting flowers outside the ward as a promise that beauty could return. The boy read her words again and again, his heart aching but alive. She had survived. She was healing others. She was still his light in the shadows. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it beside the silver cross and Daniel's poem. 3 fragments of the past, 3 reminders of why he must live. The war was over, but the road home was not just a path through villages and fields. It was a journey through memory, grief, and survival. And he had only just begun to walk it. The room was quiet when the old man finished speaking. A dim evening light filtered through the curtains, painting the walls in gold and gray. His voice had grown softer as the memories poured out until it was no more than a whisper, fragile, trembling, yet steady with truth. The child sat beside him, wide-eyed, fingers still wrapped around his wrinkled hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of the story hung in the air, heavy yet sacred. "Grandfather," a child whispered at last. Did it really happen, all of it? The old man's tired eyes, still carrying shadows of mud and fire, turned to the child. He nodded. Yes, every word. The faces I lost, the promises I carry, they are all with me still. The child's eyes glistened. And Thomas? Daniel? The nurse Anna? The dim evening light filtered through the curtains, painting the walls in gold and gray. His voice had grown softer as the memories poured out, until it was no more than a whisper, fragile, trembling, yet steady with truth. The child sat beside him, wide-eyed, fingers still wrapped around his wrinkled hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of the story hung in the air, heavy yet sacred. Grandfather, the child whispered at last, did it really happen, all of it? The old man's tired eyes, still carrying shadows of mud and fire, turned to the child. He nodded. Yes, every word. The faces I lost, the promises I carry, they are all with me still. The child's eyes glistened. And Thomas, Daniel, the nurse Anna? The old man leaned back, his breath slow, his eyes reflecting both the pain of the past and the peace of the present. That war, he said, is never glory. It is mud, blood, and loss. It steals, it scars, it breaks. But even in the darkest trenches, there can be brotherhood. Even in ruins, there can be love. Even after death, there can be memory. Never forget the cost of hatred. Never forget the value of peace. If you carry one lesson from me, let it be this. Peace is not weakness. Peace is survival. Peace is the courage to choose life. The old man smiled faintly, though sorrow lingered. Thomas and Daniel live here, he said, pressing a hand to his heart. Not a day passes that I do not hear their laughter or feel their hands lifting me from the mud. As for Anna, he paused, eyes drifting to the window. She wrote to me for years. We met again after the war. For a time, we shared the silence together. She was the light I never deserved, but always needed. The child squeezed his hand tighter. Were you happy? The old man's gaze softened. His voice cracked, but his words were steady. Happiness is not something war leaves untouched. But I learned this. Life, no matter how broken, is worth living. For them. For those who never came home. For the ones who still can. He fell silent, his thumb brushing over the child's small fingers. His hand was rough, lined with years of labor, yet warm. The child studied him with innocent wonder. What lesson should I remember most?